Well, hello. It's VLGA Connect Summer Series. How about our new opening titles, Stephen Cooper? How special was that?
Just stellar work yet again by the rather expert JLF. I'm just done, but a bit disappointed, Chris, that you got the coconut daiquiri and I got the beach ball.
I think that's appropriate. But look, I do like the hat. And so therefore, I think perhaps I should put on a cap and a little nod to the world champions this year. You know who this is, surely.
Now, I'm not sure if it's the Atlanta Braves or the Oakland A's.
It is the Atlanta Braves.
Oh, there you go.
Yes, and it's not sitting very well, so I don't think it'll stay on for very long. Welcome, and thanks to Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, who sponsor this nonsense every week as we bring you what's happening around the world of governance and local government. And it's, of course, that time of the year. I know you must be very excited. The Ashes have started. And what do we find at the intersection of governance and cricket, if anything, this week, Steve?
In fact, I'm really struggling. There was I did say a comment this morning that the political landscape in both England and Australia perhaps might be drifting away from substance, so the series could be decided on spin, Chris. Not my line, but I quite liked it.
Yes. And nothing out of Yorkshire this week?
Only, in fact, a week old. Michael Vaughan was stood down from the BBC commentary series because of a potential conflict of interest, but the Foxtel team had no such scruples, so he's still got a job.
Okay. All right. That's dispensed with the cricket, but it is summer series, so we can do that. We'll talk a bit about what we've got in store for you across summer too from VLGA Connect before we wrap up today. I've got to confess, Steve, this one missed me completely, but yesterday, I believe, was a special day of recognition. That you're
a red letter day, Chris. Yesterday was World Anti-Corruption Day, and IBAC had a webinar which I caught part of with David Wolfe and Stephen Farrow, assistant IBAC commissioners. I believe it was well attended, although you can't quite see in that webinar style. But I know sort of organisations like Transparency International and so forth have been very prominent in the last week. And I think the point that's really been made is that where we get corruption, we actually end up diverting resources from where they should go. And at a time like now, it's never been more important.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with that. Good points. I do have a good excuse for missing that yesterday. It was the first time I was out and about for some in-person meetings across in the city of Whittlesea. And then last night, was delighted to be part of the LG Pro AGM and members event to catch up with quite a few colleagues from around the sector. So it was a nice event.
It's always a terrific event, Chris, and congratulations to the board and CEO at LG Pro.
And congratulations to Liana Thompson, who is president again for, I think, now the third consecutive year at LG.
Didn't know that bit of news.
There you go. Bit of press news for you. I only know because I was there when that happened. Now, the news that's happened this week, we've got quite a bit to get through, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts as always, Steve. I think this is one we might be talking about a bit over the coming months. Councillors deciding to throw their hat in the ring for other levels of government. The immediate past mayor of Mornington Peninsula Shire, the wonderful Despy O'Connor, has announced this week that she'll run as an independent in the seat of Flinders. Now, that's the seat, of course, that's been held for 20 years or so by Greg Hunt, the health minister, who's stepping down. So bit of a blank sheet of paper here, Steve. But I thought it might be interesting to talk about what should councillors be considering in terms of their obligations if they're looking to perhaps make a run at another level of government.
I'll preface my comments, Chris, by saying that Tony Rounick and I had an interesting conversation about this this week, and there was generally a meeting of minds between us, but Tony might be starting to type in some comments on LinkedIn and say that Steve Cooper doesn't speak for me and come up with his own view. Yeah. But the conversation that we had was around the fact that in some ways the Act is silent on the detail, but it provides some principles. So you sort of have to look at what's the issue for a councillor who is standing as a candidate at another level of government. Well, we could start with as a councillor, indeed, and the Local Government Act certainly deals with that because we have a thing called an election period. And so councillors are councillors until we get into the election period, and then the activities of councillors are curtailed. At other levels of government, that's not so clear, but it kind of raises the question around what's the kind of potential innate conflicts between them acting as a councillor in the interest of community and seeking to be elected. Now, we'll all say that we do the right thing and we try to do the right thing, but there's also questions of public perception, I suppose, Chris.
Yeah. So can we just sort of drill down as to what are the actual obligations as opposed to what might be accepted as best practice?
Well, the obligations are to avoid conflict of interest and to avoid perception of conflict of interest. And in terms of the positioning with where one might sit as an electoral candidate and the decisions one might make as a councillor, it's really difficult to draw a conclusion generally or particularly, because the council will always say, well, I voted the way I thought. So in that sense, the Act is silent and doesn't require anything, but clearly it's an issue because our friends at the MAV have a rather excellent guide for, in fact, let me just quickly find what it's called, Chris. It's an MAV guideline called Councillors Standing for State or Federal Elections, which gives a bit of a sense of, or in fact more than a sense of what councillors ought to do. The conversation Tony and I had was very much around that notion that, in fact, you know, if you took the highest of moral high grounds, the nanosecond that a councillor decided to act as a candidate elsewhere, they might stand aside or take leave of absence because of that sort of conflict that we've talked about. Where is the underlying duty to be elected or to be a councillor, and what would the general public say? Not those who are closest to you or those who are your worst enemy. What's the reasonable person test? Now, the guidelines don't quite go to that point, but they really they basically provide for a two-step process. One is that when a councillor considers that they're going to stand, that that announcement should be, or that detail should be provided to the CEO and at a meeting of council. So everyone's incredibly clear. Yes. There is absolutely no doubt that this person is going to be a candidate. And then the next step being that when the nomination is lodged, that the councillor ought to stand aside and take leave of absence. And the only thing the Act says is that you can't be a Member of Parliament at another level and a councillor at the same time. So if successful, at that point, a resignation as a councillor would need to take effect immediately.
Is this another example of how the Act takes a more principles-based approach to things? So the only prescription here is if you're ultimately elected, obviously you can't continue to hold the office of councillor. But people seem to be saying the right thing to do is probably to take a leave of absence at some point. And the timing's interesting, isn't it? Because in Despy's case, we don't know when the federal election is. So, you know, it probably isn't an option to stand aside yet until you've got some idea of the timing, correct? Or should she actually be thinking that now that I've declared, maybe I should step aside for a while? Yeah,
and I mean, the election could be as early as March, but maybe as late as May. If it was March, standing aside now wouldn't be of any particular moment, Chris. I agree. I'm not sure. I agree with you in the sense that the Act is more principles-based now. But my memory is that previous Acts haven't really gone to great detail on this point anyway. And there's always been this sort of requirement to navigate your way through these ethical issues in a way that kind of avoids those conflicts. There is another matter that we need to talk about too, about use of council resources. So I think in that sense, props to the MAV for the production of that guideline, because it does, whilst not perfect, the world is imperfect anyway in this case, and I think it makes a really good effort to navigate through this space.
Is that guideline publicly available through the MAV website, or do people need to get in touch with the MAV to find it?
I found it on Google the other day, Chris, so I would say it is publicly available, but I'm sure that, in fact, council governance staff who are affected might be interested to get a copy as well.
Well, I'd be recommending that they do have a look at that just in case, because I'm sure this won't be the last time this comes up, because not only have we got federal government, federal election happening, but we're not that far off a state one too. So we're probably going to be, and the same conditions would apply whether it's state or federal, correct?
Exactly, that's right, Chris. And I mean, the other point that's made in that document is that really it's very important for candidates to ensure that they've got to comply with the Local Government Act, but they also need to comply with the whatever the jurisdiction is for which they're standing for office. Can I add to what you just said too, Chris? One thing I did find was a rather excellent piece of work that the administrators acting as the council at South Gippsland Shire had done, and in my quick reading, that is a cracking good policy where they've given the issue a lot of thought, really with the benefit of not being potentially affected and thinking through what the implications would be for any candidate. There's a number of approaches too. Some councils have gone down the separate policy path. Many would include a section in the governance rules in relation to candidacy, just as the election period policies now wrapped up in the governance rules, Chris.
So that was going to be my question. I'm assuming most councils, if not all, governance rules are silent on this particular issue, but is that the appropriate place where they could deal with such an occurrence?
It would make sense to me to put it in the governance rules, I'd have to say, Chris. That, seems a logical spot to deal with.
If not a separate policy.
Exactly. I mean, you wouldn't die in a ditch over either. Both are okay, because both really then put an onus back on the council, or that if there is a policy that's adopted by the council, well, it's a very strong signal to follow the policy. Chris, one other point, of course, is there's the perception of bias, the perception of conflict of duty, I suppose, in holding the two offices. The other area that's pointed to in the MAV guideline is the importance of avoiding perception of the use, or actuality, in fact, of the use of council resources in association with the campaign.
So just perhaps now that you've gone there, let's say a little bit more about that. The obvious one that comes to mind is, council provided mobile phones that might get used for purposes other than council business. So this is not dissimilar to what councillors are advised to be careful of during election periods for council elections, correct?
Oh, absolutely. But you've got a situation there where all councillors are in the same boat, and there are different approaches. Some councils during an election period, the CEO takes back those resources, and then that means there's no doubt. Others leave the resources, but the councillors with a fairly clear message that they shouldn't be used. I think there is a real exposure for any candidate, though, Chris, of a sort of inadvertent use.
Yeah.
Accidentally picking up the wrong phone, someone contacting the person on a council mobile, resources that might be personal resources that are stored on a council device. So, and of course, I think the New South Wales, or the former New South Wales Premier, recently said in regard to a conflict of interest allegation, but I always act in the interest of my community. When you're confronted with an allegation, that doesn't count, so an abundance of caution would be recommended.
All right. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this topic as we hear potentially more announcements in the lead up to both federal and state elections, as I've said. So thanks for that, Steve, and all the best to Councillor O'Connor with her campaign. I don't think, have we missed any other announcements yet?
Well, the other two that I know of are Councillor Claudia Haynell at Horsham and Councillor Rob Priestley at Greater Shepparton, who are also both standing as independents, but I'm sure there are others.
Okay, so perhaps I need to start a list so we can keep...
Well, yeah, hopefully the CEO list will sort of slow down a bit, Chris, and you'll have some time to do that.
Well, just on that, seeing as you mentioned CEOs, we do want to congratulate Fiona Blair, who's been appointed as the CEO at Brimbank. And Fiona, I think you've worked with Fiona.
Former work colleague at Port Phillip, Chris. So, yeah, congratulations to Fiona. That'll be terrific for Brimbank and terrific for her. And she inherits a well-oiled machine from Helen Morrissey.
And there'll be some people very pleased to see that ratio of male-female CEOs is unaffected ultimately with Fiona's appointment. We do note that up at Wodonga, an acting CEO has been appointed, and logically it's the deputy CEO from within the organisation, Deborah Mudra, who is stepping into the role that will be vacated by Mark Dixon, and they'll be recruiting for a CEO early in the new year. So congratulations to Deborah.
Absolutely, in good spot Wodonga, and lots of challenges and, the benefits of being a regional city. That's a plum job.
It sure is. So, yeah, I'm sure that'll be hotly contested. Steve, I was invited on to ABC Radio Mildura Swan Hill last week for a chat about the CEO issue because people are starting to notice there's a lot of CEO vacancies. In fact, now that Greenbank's been appointed, there's 8 currently waiting to be resolved, but 4 of them are up in that northwest pocket of the state, and they're wondering what's going on that we've got all of these vacancies occurring.
Coincidentally, Chris, I did happen to hear your interview with James Finlay on ABC Mildura Swan Hill, and well done on that. And I think anyone just checking your following you on Twitter, you've posted the link in the appropriate start spot, as I recall.
Yeah, I have too, and on LinkedIn as well. And I know a few people have clicked on that, which is nice. A couple of other things in the news this week that are worth noting. So this story out of Hume, I was a bit surprised about this situation, Steve, but then again, perhaps I shouldn't be, having been around local government as long as I have, but there's one councillor there that's lodged, I think it was so many complaints, it's led to 22 investigations. It's cost the council more than $50,000 to conduct those investigations. It's a new councillor who's yet to appear in person at a meeting. It's had some virtual appearances, but a few apologies as well. It's a bit hard to understand how someone could have so many complaints against fellow councillors that for the most part, they haven't met.
It's an interesting one, Chris, and we don't know unless we're in the space, but and COVID's sort of thrown up some interesting situations too. But I just am mindful, and just on to the point you made, that council codes of conduct talk to the importance of seeking informal resolution, and that number of formal complaints would sort of indicate that perhaps some more effort could be made at that informal stage. And I just note that Section 28(2)(d) of the Local Government Act in relation to the duties of council requires that councillors comply with council procedures required for good governance. And one of those procedures, to my mind, would be doing whatever one can to have a productive work relationship with one's colleagues.
That's really well said. I think you've hit the nail on the head, and perhaps we don't need to say too much more about that because I notice the latest is that the councillor was directed to make an apology by the council and is now getting legal advice on whether they have to do that or not. So we won't stray too much into the details.
The process will take its course, Chris.
It will. Sad news out of the city of Maroondah this week. Former Mayor Councillor Nora Lamont was the second female mayor in Maroondah's history and had 2 terms as mayor, has had to stand down. I read her Facebook post. It's quite sad. She's dealing with a rare and chronic autoimmune disease that's been impacting on her ability to work and to do her councillor role. So we wish her all the best, and it's not the circumstances that we want to see forcing a councillor to resign. No,
it's the role is challenging enough anyway, Chris. So good luck to Nora in the future.
Absolutely. And there's been 2 resignations now at Moira Shire, Steve. So we've got Kevin Burke, we knew about last month, stood down just after the mayor election, and now Murray Martin has stood down as a councillor. So that means there's 2 countbacks coming up at Moira, one of them next week to fill Kevin Burke's position, and the other has been scheduled by the VEC for January.
January?
Yeah, 19th of January.
That's they've moved very quickly, haven't they? I must admit, I'm a bit surprised by that, Chris. I sort of presumed February, but well...
unless I've got it wrong, I'll have to go back and check the...
Well, I suppose as a countback, really, it's administrative, so the sooner the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is something happening in February, dragging the depths of it's a by-election for Yarra Rangers.
That's it. Yeah. And maybe that was what mucked my brain up too.
So there's a bit happening there. I feel like I've got to start another list, keeping track of councillors that have resigned and countbacks and by-elections, and see how busy that list gets over the term of the council, Steve.
Yeah, I think it sort of increases exponentially as the term rolls on. Would be
and with as we've said, two elections coming up at state and federal too, which might impact. Who knows? There's a rich history of councillors stepping up into representative roles at the state and the federal levels, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Now, the Essential Service Commission has released its compliance report. So every year it does a review of whether councils are complying with the rate cap. And pleasing to know, and not surprising, that all councils have complied this year with the rate cap, which was set at 1.5%. I think there were some interesting stats in here, though, Steve. The Commission has noted that waste charges have increased at some councils by between 10 and 27%. Of course, these aren't under the cap. And the service charge revenue per property at 19 councils increased by more than 10%. And I don't know whether you could call it firing a shot across the bow, but they've said they're going to monitor that trend closely.
That'll be interesting, Chris, because particularly with the waste charges, we know that the costs to councils associated with delivery of waste services have increased. But I also wonder, in a rate capping environment, knowing that charges under the Act, as you said, are not constrained by the cap, but they are constrained by the fact that the councils need to account for direct end-to-end costs associated with those services. Now, there must be a point, and maybe at times early days councils weren't bringing particular costs under, but there must be a point where those costs have maxed out, if you like.
Yeah, true. So as I said, I think it's interesting that they've made a point of saying we're going to monitor that trend. So perhaps they're subtly saying councils are on notice with regard to the way they treat those charges.
Yeah, perhaps. I hope it's not too punitive though, Chris, because people really notice when their rubbish doesn't get picked up, and people really notice if services aren't conducted regularly. And in the current environment, these are expensive services, so it would be a pity if council services generally were impacted by the costs in these areas.
Yeah, good, all good points, and possibly that's why the message is as soft as it is at this point.
Yeah.
I want to go into state just briefly with a bit of news this week. Don't think that Victoria is the only state that deals with issues that get quite serious for councils, because we've had a council dismissed this week, and it's the Norfolk Island Regional Council. They've been subject to a public inquiry for some months now, which is now completed, and found that council has failed to manage its finances in accordance with the principles of effective financial and asset management. So the elected members have been dismissed, and an administrator, Mr. Michael Colreevy, has been installed for a period of 3 years. And this is an interesting situation because Norfolk is under the purview of the federal minister, that's Nola Marino, the Assistant Minister for Regional Development and Territories. But I think they work under the New South Wales Local Government Act. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it's not something I knew before you just told me, Chris, so thank you for your research there. Interesting too, isn't it, that that follows hot on the heels of an inquiry which I don't believe's been released yet into the financial management at the Central Coast Council in New South Wales. So sort of some recurring themes, and I've got to say I feel a bit culpable because when the Local Government Act was released, Section 101, of course, as you know, governance aficionados will know, is the financial management principles of the Act, and they all seem really self-evident. So, but perhaps it's a reminder for councillors and executives to just make sure that they're doing their due diligence around financial management, because this is becoming a bit of a trend in New South Wales, and we're not always that much different.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about New South Wales, the elections, of course, were held last weekend. So yes. It's going to take some time for those results to be finalised. It's quite a few weeks as they work through that process of counting first preferences and distributions, etc. But in doing a bit of research on that, I did discover something that I didn't know, and I'm going to test you, Steve. How many councils in New South Wales are under administration currently?
Chris, you know my views on questions without notice. Look, I couldn't say. I'm guessing 3.
You're close. It's actually 4. I was surprised. Yeah, so we've got 2 in Victoria. Of course, we did have 3, but it's Balranald.
Hang on.
Yeah.
You want to say Wingecarribee, don't you?
Ah, you've just taken the wind out of my sails. It's Balranald, Central Coast, Central Darling, and Wingecarribee.
I didn't know about Central Darling, so there you go.
So they're not that far removed from Victoria, are they? Central Darling and Balranald, I think, are pretty close to Victoria.
In my youth, Chris, growing up in Swan Hill, Balranald was a fairly regular destination. So no, not that far.
Is that right? Well, there you go. We've learned something about you. All right, just a little bit of trivia. What else have we got on the list?
Actually, sorry, can I just make the comment too, Chris? And in Balranald, wearing an Akubra would not be out of place.
But probably wearing an Atlanta Braves cap would be.
Ooh, no.
All right.
They're pretty advanced up there.
Now, just want to make a few notes before we go. These are things we'll be talking about very soon. The Know Your Council performance data has all been updated. So that website has the new data for the 2021 period as of this week. So the local government tragics out there that might want to compare councils on various performance measures, knock yourself out. You'll be doing that, Steve, I imagine.
Oh, can't wait, Chris.
So that's there. We think the discussion paper for the local government cultural review will be released imminently, and the local government minister, Sean Lean, has agreed to speak with us for a special VLGA Connect once that paper is out there. So stand by for that. We think that's coming this week. Yes. He's also due, the minister that is, to set the rate cap for 2022-2023. That needs to happen by the end of December. So watching brief on that. Haven't heard any more for a week or two, but the tribunal is due to set the mayor and councillor allowances any day. I think we're expecting that before the end of the calendar year.
They were hoping to do it before Christmas, I believe. So
stand by for that. And another thing that's imminent is the announcement of who the monitor will be at Yarra City Council. My mail is that's very close as well.
Wow, no wonder we couldn't get round to talking about trees today, Chris.
Trees is on our standby list for the week that we don't have much to talk about during the summer.
Trees is looking like about mid-January, the rate we're going, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Always good to chat. I think you're up to date, folks, on what's happening around the sector in terms of governance news. Hope you have a great week. What are you up to, Steve? Is things starting to slow down for you?
Next week's still full on, but after that, we're doing all of those sort of policy tasks that we tell ourselves we're going to do over Christmas, January.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun. No doubt with the Ashes commentary on in the background.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Steve. Have a good one. Talk soon.
Cheers, Chris.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff at the VLGA. That's your VLGA Connect governance update for our first summer series edition, with thanks to Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Thanks for your company. See you again soon.